How do you make billions vanish in the 14th century? Without anyone noticing, no computers, no networks, no modern banks. And yet one of the most powerful financial systems in Europe collapsed almost overnight. No audit trails, no ledgers, no surviving records. The organization behind it, a monastic military order sworn to poverty. But somehow the Knights Templar mastered money. Not just gold, not just lending. A transcontinental system of deposits, transfers, and coded credit notes, centuries before Wall Street, was even an idea. And then, it disappeared. So what happened to the Templar financial empire? And is it possible that parts of it never really vanished at all? Tonight, we begin an investigation, not into treasure or relics, but something far stranger, the invisible architecture of a medieval banking system so advanced it left its fingerprints on modern finance, while erasing its name from history. You've heard the stories. Templar knights riding into the Holy Land, white mantles billowing behind them. You've seen the symbols, the twin horsemen, the red cross stitched into centuries of myth and mistrust. But behind the armor and piety was something quieter, stranger, a kind of power far more dangerous than swords' economic sovereignty. While kingdoms borrowed and bled, the Templars quietly built a financial engine, one that linked cities and ports, abbeys and castles, courts and crusades. From Paris to Acre London to Jerusalem, they created a web of wealth storage, encrypted communication, and long-distance transfers that looked uncannily like modern banking. But there's a catch. When the arrests came in 1307, kings expected vaults stuffed with gold. What they found instead confused them. And within a few years, most documentation, the lifeblood of a financial system, had simply ceased to exist. So was it all destroyed, hidden, absorbed by something else? Or did the system survive in forms no one recognized? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because tonight, we're not chasing myths. We're following the money. They weren't born bankers. They didn't begin as scribes, financiers, or stewards of royal treasure. No, the men who would go on to reshape medieval economics began with swords in hand, cloaked in vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, more commonly known as the Knights Templar, were founded in 1119 with a singular purpose to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Nothing in their early charter hinted at financial ambition. And yet, within just a few decades, they began to accumulate not just land, but leverage. It started simply. A nobleman fearing for his soul or grateful for divine favor might donate a vineyard in Gascony or a small plot of farmland in England. Multiply that a few hundred times across dozens of regions, and suddenly this austere brotherhood began managing a surprisingly vast estate. That's when things got interesting. Because unlike many religious orders, the Templars didn't just sit on their assets. They managed them. They leased out lands, sold off excess grain, reinvested in mills, even took fees from toll bridges. It was in essence a quiet economic engine, rural, stable, and slow-moving. But the foundation was laid. This transformation was no accident. At the time, most monks were cloistered behind abbey walls. But the Templars moved constantly. They were warriors, diplomats, administrators. They needed efficiency, communication, and standardization. So they developed it. And somewhere in that early growth phase, they crossed a threshold most military orders never approached. They became not just landowners, but trusted custodians of other people's assets. The shift was subtle at first. A lord departing for the Crusades might entrust the Templars with his estate. Another might ask them to hold a chest of coin until his return. Some began using them to settle debts between regions. The reputation of the Templars as incorruptible, bolstered by their oath-bound lifestyle, made them the safest pair of hands available in a fragmented, often lawless Europe. Yet not everyone saw them through such a charitable lens. Even in their early days there were whispers. Why did they answer to no king? Why were their lands exempt from local taxes? Why were they allowed to cross borders unchallenged, carrying cargo no one was allowed to inspect? The truth is, their rapid accumulation of privilege bred suspicion long before their financial acumen was truly understood. Historians still debate how intentional any of this was. Were the Templars' masterminds coldly building a transcontinental financial infrastructure under the guise of religious duty? Or were they simply opportunistic stewards, gradually swept into more complex roles by the circumstances of war pilgrimage and trust? Some records suggest deliberate design. Others hint at an organization constantly adapting, constantly solving practical problems with whatever tools lay at hand. There is one curious document from the early 12th century, a letter from a papal legate commenting on the sums of money managed by the temple. The tone is bemused, almost alarmed, as if even then church officials didn't quite understand the scale of what was happening. That would become a theme. Over and over throughout the next 2 centuries, local bishops, abbots, and even cardinals would find themselves baffled by what the Templars had built. What's most important to understand is this: the Templars did not invent finance. They did not bring money into the church. But they did something few dared to do. They systematized it. They professionalized it. And eventually, they made it mobile. We often think of medieval life as rigid, slow, and disconnected. But the Templars operated on a different frequency. Their structure was hierarchical, yet mobile. Their members were both monks and knights. Their loyalties were not to kings, but to the Grand Master, and through him to the Pope. This made them uncommonly nimble. They could respond to crises, reallocate resources, or enforce policy faster than many kingdoms could raise an army. Of course, with that agility came opacity. Their internal communications were coded. Their archives were centralized. And most frustrating of all for modern scholars, their financial records, when they existed, were treated as sacred secrets. Even today, only fragments remain. And that brings us to a troubling paradox. For an organization so intertwined with medieval power, the Templars left behind remarkably few surviving documents, especially about their money. This has led some to believe they destroyed the records themselves, a scorched earth maneuver during their downfall. Others argue the documents were seized, absorbed, or simply misfiled by successor institutions. But whatever the truth, the absence of evidence has fed centuries of speculation. One thing is clear: by the mid-12th century, the Templars were already functioning as something far greater than a military brotherhood. They had become a network, spiritual, martial, and financial. One that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the gates of Jerusalem. And as we'll soon discover, their mastery of money would prove both their greatest strength and their undoing. The Holy Land was not cheap. Behind every lance, every mailed knight, every castle wall in Outremer stood an unspoken calculation. Someone had to pay for it. Not just in blood, but in coin, and lots of it. War, as it turned out, was the crucible in which the Templars' financial evolution began to accelerate. When the first knights of the Temple rode out, their expenses were modest. A horse, some armor, the upkeep of a commandery here or there. But by the mid-12th century, they were fielding armies, garrisoning fortresses, maintaining fleets, and provisioning caravans. The logistics of crusading warfare were monstrous and unstable. Supply lines stretched across continents. Communication was delayed by weeks. and inflation, ever the quiet predator, nibbled at every coin sent eastward. This growing pressure forced the Templars to think differently. Unlike secular lords who could simply raise taxes or plunder neighbors, the Templars had no peasantry to exploit, no gold mines to tap. Instead, they had trust. Not just spiritual trust, though that helped, but practical earned trust from nobles and monarchs who began to see the Templars as reliable custodians of wealth. And in wartime, that trust was everything. The first glimpse of their evolving role comes in a curious 1150 record from King Alfonso III of Aragon. His will, written shortly before his death, left large tracts of his kingdom to the Templars, Hospitallers, and the Church. Though the politics of this move remain murky, the economic implications are striking here. Was a monarch treating a military order as a viable long-term administrator of his assets? Not just a recipient of donations, but a capable steward of real capital. Over the next decades, this role deepened. French and English lords began depositing funds with the Templars before departing on crusade, knowing they could draw upon the same funds in the Levant. Soldiers could be paid locally, suppliers reimbursed, and when the fighting paused, or when a lord failed to return, the Templars were left holding both the assets and the records. This arrangement gave them power. Quiet, indirect, and deniable, but power nonetheless. With every deposit came a new relationship, a new obligation, a new opportunity. And slowly the Templars stopped being just guardians of treasure. They became its brokers. Of course, not everyone was thrilled by this development. Some nobles accused the Templars of manipulating accounts, charging fees, or withholding returns. There were whispers of double entries and hidden margins, but without widespread literacy or access to records, most complaints faded into frustrated shrugs. The order's reputation, bolstered by its vows and papal protection, usually won out. What's most intriguing is how early the Templars began experimenting with centralized financial planning. Instead of relying on scattered local treasuries, they started pooling resources regionally, then coordinating disbursements according to broader strategic needs. A shipment of grain from Cyprus might fund the repair of a castle near Antioch. A donation in Normandy might underwrite a garrison in Jaffa. This was not simply charity, it was capital reallocation. Some scholars argue this was the moment the Templars became more than a military order, that their need to finance war forced them to innovate, to take risks, to think like bankers long before that word even existed in its modern form. The evidence is scattered, often inferred from correspondence or receipts, but it paints a consistent picture. The Templars were constantly solving the problem of how to move store and spend money across vast, dangerous distances. There's one tantalizing fragment, a partial ledger found near Tortosa, listing disbursements not in coin, but in kind, salt, wool, spices, timber. Each item assigned a monetary value, each trade cross-referenced by region. It suggests a level of abstraction rare for the time, a shift away from physical currency toward conceptual accounts. This is where the seeds of financial modernity first show through the medieval dust. Yet the scale of this system created risks. Wars dragged on, revenues dipped, donations slowed, and still the Templars had to pay. Sometimes they borrowed, sometimes they overextended, and occasionally they quietly monetized their lands to generate liquidity. These decisions, necessary in the short term, would come back to haunt them when their paper wealth could no longer be redeemed for physical treasure. Today, historians still debate just how advanced the Templars' wartime financial system truly was. Some see them as proto-central bankers managing regional economies and issuing credit. Others warn against projecting modern ideas onto a world still dominated by feudal relationships and physical exchange. But even skeptics agree the Templars weren't just financing war, they were learning from it. And the most important lesson they learned: control the supply lines, and you control the battlefield. Control the money behind the supply lines, and you control the war. It began as many medieval financial shifts did with piety. A nobleman, wealthy, aging, or simply fearful of his soul's destination, might grant land or coin to the Knights Templar. These acts of charity were public, performative, and deeply symbolic. A gift to God's warriors was a gift to heaven itself, or at least it looked that way. But somewhere along the line, that charity transformed into something more transactional. The earliest Templar donations were one-directional. A vineyard here, a sheepfold there, perhaps a lump sum in silver. But as the order's reputation grew and its footprint expanded, more individuals began giving to the Templars, not just as an act of faith, but as a form of strategic placement. Estates could be entrusted, not just given. Funds could be deposited with conditions. A noble heading to the Crusades might donate a manor to the Templars, with the implicit understanding that it would be returned upon his safe return or inherited by his son if not. And so the lines began to blur. Was it a gift, a loan, a deposit with spiritual overtones? Medieval terminology didn't yet have precise language for these arrangements, and the Templars, ever adept at navigating ambiguities, rarely clarified them. What they did do, however, was keep careful track. Somewhere in their growing network of commanderies, documents were drawn up, witnessed, and stored. Agreements were recorded even if few survive today. It wasn't just nobles either. Monasteries, merchants, even bishops began placing assets under Templar stewardship, sometimes for safekeeping, sometimes for strategic management, occasionally as a political maneuver to shield property from taxation or confiscation by secular powers. After all, once a field or manor was owned by the temple, it enjoyed papal protection and Templar immunity from most local legal authorities. That made it a very convenient place to park your wealth. This shift was not merely philosophical, it was practical. And it required infrastructure. Templar preceptories evolved into more than garrisons. They became administrative hubs, staffed not just by knights, but by scribes, stewards, and clerks who managed agricultural output tax collection and increasingly account balances. In some houses, small rooms were set aside for written records, safe boxes, and even the occasional vault beneath the stone floor. Visitors were logged, inventories tallied, letters sent. There's one account from a German abbey around 1220 describing a visiting Templar who arrived with a chest of coin, a roll of parchment, and an armed escort. The document claims, with some evident suspicion, that the knight insisted on a private audience with the abbot conducted behind closed doors. The implication was clear: the Templars weren't just transporting wealth, they were negotiating its control. Modern historians still debate the extent to which these practices resembled true banking. After all, there was no central currency authority, no fixed interest rates, no concept of credit ratings. But the mechanisms were undeniably financial. The Templars accepted deposits, they made transfers, they managed third-party assets, and crucially, they began to treat these flows as something systematizable. One overlooked detail suggests the depth of this transformation. In at least 3 surviving charters from the early 13th century, the same phrasing appears to be held by the temple in good faith and returned upon demand should the Lord will it. It's that last clause, should the Lord will it, that raises eyebrows. Part devotional, part legal hedge. It illustrates how deftly the Templars straddled the worlds of faith and finance. If a deposit was lost in war or confiscated or spent, well, God's will was inscrutable, convenient. As this hybrid model grew, so did the tension around it. Was a deposit a sacred trust, or a financial product? Could the temple spend funds entrusted to it if it promised to repay them later? And what happened when demand outstripped liquidity? We may never know the full extent of the Templars' internal accounting practices, but we do know this: by the early 1200s, they were managing immense quantities of movable wealth. And that meant, whether they admitted it or not, they had become something very close to a bank. But unlike modern banks, the Templars had no regulatory oversight, no transparency requirements, no public audits. Their only real authority was themselves and the Pope, who rarely interfered. That made them both uniquely trusted and uniquely dangerous. There is an open debate among medieval economists about just how much of the Templar network functioned like a closed-loop system. Did one preceptory know what another held? Were balances standardized? Or did each region act semi-independently, trusting that the collective would resolve any inconsistencies? Some argue for a decentralized model. Others believe there must have been some form of central accounting, possibly housed in the Paris Temple, the order's de facto headquarters. One thing is certain: the donations never really stopped. But the idea of a simple, generous gift slowly gave way to something colder, harder, and far more difficult to define. The Templars had begun to hold money for others, and in doing so they had become more than monks, more than knights. They had become custodians of trust. And in the medieval world, that was a currency even gold couldn't buy. Imagine a spiderweb stretching across medieval Europe, not of silk and shadow, but of stone and scrolls. At each junction, a preceptory. A fortress, yes, but also a financial outpost. The Templar network by the late 12th century had become something far greater than the sum of its parts. It was, in essence, the first functioning international treasury. This transformation wasn't sudden. It crept in through necessity. As the order's assets ballooned, so did its logistical burdens. Local administrators could no longer operate in isolation. Funds needed to move quickly, securely, and across borders. So the Templars built a system. No kings, no parliaments, no royal mints. Just monks in chainmail moving wealth along corridors that only they could access. Each commandery played a role. Some were small, a few hectares of farmland, a granary, a chapel. Others, like the Paris Temple, were sprawling complexes with vaults, stables, and offices, but all were linked in purpose, if not always in documentation. A brother knight in Aragon could request supplies from Poitou. A master in Antioch could access funds deposited in Bruges. It wasn't seamless, but it was effective, and more importantly, it was trusted. One of the strangest facts about this system is how few physical coins were actually needed at any given moment. While kings struggled to mint reliable currency, the Templars leaned into abstraction. They learned that a note carried by a knight bearing the seal of the temple was often as good as or better than gold. A vault in London didn't need to send coin to Acre. It only needed to acknowledge that value had been transferred. The order would settle it internally. Of course, such a system required something else: record-keeping. And while few Templar ledgers survive, hints of their internal communications remain. A rare fragment from a Burgundian archive describes monthly balance letters sent between houses, summarizing receipts, expenditures, and outstanding obligations. The phrasing is dry, painfully so, but the implications are profound. These were not monks copying psalms. They were administrators reconciling accounts across hundreds of miles. One controversial detail in that same fragment notes a practice called portum redere, to return the portion. It suggests a kind of profit-sharing model among commanderies, wherein wealth generated in one region could be partially distributed to another in need. This flies in the face of how most medieval institutions functioned. It wasn't feudal, it wasn't serfdom, it was remarkably corporate, and yet no central bank, no printed currency, no reserves set by external policy. The Templar treasury operated on faith not divine but reputational. Everyone from merchants to monarchs believed the Templars would honor their commitments, and so they did, until they couldn't. Still, the structure held. Templar couriers carried letters and payment orders between nodes. Specific routes were mapped and guarded. In some cases, sealed iron chests were transported chained to saddles guarded by armed escort. But more often than not, the money moved on paper, not hoof. A kind of invisible current flowed beneath the visible world, powering crusades, financing diplomacy, and underpinning trade, all without the need for a single coin to change hands. Historians point to a strange episode in 1260 to illustrate just how sophisticated this had become. In that year, a dispute arose between two merchant houses in Venice and Toulouse over a missing shipment. Both claimed to have paid for the same cargo. Enter the Templars. Records from their Lion commandery reveal they were able to produce a certified statement, confirming the original transfer order complete with the seal of the Venetian partner. This resolved the dispute without arbitration. In short, the Templars were acting as notaries, auditors, and guarantors, centuries before modern equivalents existed. What's still debated is how centralized this system truly was. Did the Grand Master in Paris oversee everything? Was there a central treasury where accounts were settled, balances maintained, discrepancies resolved? Some believe the Paris Temple served this role, its thick walls protecting not just gold, but parchment, the real wealth of the order. Others argue for a more distributed model, where each region handled its own affairs, with only occasional coordination from above. Regardless, the order functioned as a kind of de facto financial federation. No other institution at the time had anything close. Even the papacy, with its vast tithes, lacked the infrastructure the Templars enjoyed. Royal treasuries were often chaotic, subject to political whims and local revolts. But the temple, it stood apart, disciplined, hierarchical, and deeply insulated. And that insulation created danger. Kings began to notice. So did creditors. Because unlike other monastic orders, the Templars didn't just collect money, they moved it. And more than that, they knew where it came from and where it went. In hindsight, it's easy to see how this network, this invisible treasury, stitched across Europe, would inspire both awe and paranoia. It had no borders, no loyalty to crown or coin, only to itself. And yet, at its heart, it remained an illusion. No central vault stuffed with treasure. No singular ledger containing the whole. Just a scattered network of trust-sealed envelopes and the quiet confidence that when a brother in Jerusalem needed coin, a commandery in Bruges would answer. Until one day, it didn't. For most medieval travelers, the road to the Holy Land was a perilous journey, marked by hunger, illness, and the constant threat of violence. But for the wealthy, for nobles, merchants, and high clergy, another danger loomed: even larger theft. To journey from London to Acre with a chest of coin was not only impractical, it was suicidal. Every pass, every port, every border crossing was a risk. Enter the Templars with an offer both radical and reassuring. Leave your gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem. By the 1180s, this practice had become so common among crusaders and pilgrims that it no longer raised eyebrows. A traveler could visit a local Templar commandery, present a sum of coin, and receive a carefully inscribed letter bearing the order's seal. This document, written in cipher, often in Latin or coded variants of the vernacular, served as a promise. The bearer, upon reaching a distant Templar house, could present the letter and receive the corresponding value in local currency minus a modest handling fee. Sound familiar? It should. This was functionally a medieval version of the traveler's check, and for many historians, one of the earliest documented uses of a trans-regional credit instrument in European history. Unlike modern banks, the Templars didn't rely on centralized reserves or official fiat currency. What they relied on was trust. The receiving commandery honored the letter because the issuing commandery was part of the same brotherhood. It wasn't a matter of law, it was a matter of internal cohesion. One obscure account from a Genoese merchant in 1195 tells of a failed delivery due to a forged Templar letter. The forger had mimicked the seal but not the cipher, and was caught when a scribe in Acre recognized inconsistencies in the phrasing. The punishment was swift excommunication and imprisonment, but the real story is hidden in the margins. The letter had to be authenticated against internal records. That means somewhere there was a system of verification, likely based on correspondence between commanderies, or perhaps maintained in central archives. What's fascinating is how seamlessly this process seems to have worked. There are few recorded disputes between clients and the order regarding lost or denied letters. This suggests not only that the system was secure, but that it inspired rare confidence in an age where most transactions were face-to-face and cash-based. The Templars had essentially created a paper promise strong enough to replace gold. This paper-based system also served a more subtle purpose. It decoupled physical wealth from its representation. A noble could store wealth in England and access it in Acre without ever transporting coin. This wasn't just safer, it was transformative. It meant the Templars could pool resources, smooth out regional shortages, and maintain liquidity in distant territories regardless of local conditions. When the harvest failed in Champagne, funds from Portugal could ease the strain. When war flared in the Levant, donations from Tuscany could be redirected without delay. The letters weren't just receipts, they were arteries. Of course, this level of abstraction wasn't universally embraced. Some church officials viewed it with deep suspicion, even veiled hostility. A handful of synodal decrees from the late 13th century hint at anxiety over pledges without coin, a clear reference to these financial instruments. The fear was theological had the Templars crossed into usury. Were these letters effectively creating money from nothing? The debates were rarely resolved, and in typical ecclesiastical fashion, often buried beneath layers of ambiguity. The Templars, for their part, claimed only to facilitate movement, never to charge interest outright. Yet the practical impact was undeniable. The letters allowed for greater mobility, more stable prices along trade routes, and smoother provisioning of armies. They also enabled the order to operate independently of local currencies, which were notoriously unstable. In England, coinage was frequently clipped or debased. In the Crusader states, Byzantine, Islamic, and European currencies mingled in a chaotic swirl. But a Templar note sidestepped all of that. It meant essentially, this is worth what we say it's worth. And no one, not even kings, had the infrastructure to challenge that claim. Some scholars have proposed that this system also functioned as a quiet intelligence network. If letters of credit were hand-delivered by Templar riders, those same riders could carry messages, updates, even coded reports. It's plausible. The routes were secure, the messengers trusted, and the recipients almost always behind stone walls with guarded gates. It would explain in part why the Templars always seemed so well-informed, and why so many governments tolerated them for so long. This all calls back to something easily overlooked: trust. The Templars didn't just wield power. They accumulated it through discipline, discretion, and a reputation for incorruptibility. And while many of their contemporaries relied on the sword or the altar, the Temple wielded a subtler weapon, the ability to promise gold in one land and make good on it in another. It's a system that seems strangely modern, and yet it emerged from parchment wax and the quiet labor of men who called themselves poor. Poor they may have been in name, but in practice they controlled a river of wealth flowing silently through Europe, one sealed letter at a time. Let's take a slow breath here. Picture a parchment folded thrice, sealed with wax, and pressed by a signet bearing the familiar image of two knights riding a single horse. It doesn't look like much, but in the 13th century this humble document could move armies, pay mercenaries, or feed a garrison for an entire winter. It was a Templar letter of credit, and for all its mystery, it was deceptively simple. The process began with a deposit. A knight, a merchant, or a pilgrim would visit a Templar house and deliver a sum of coin. In return, he'd receive a written guarantee, a transfer note issued under the authority of the temple. The note listed the amount, the recipient's identity, and the destination where the funds could be withdrawn. What it didn't contain, at least in the surviving examples, was the actual amount in plain numbers. Instead, it used a mix of abbreviations, codes, and references to known inventories. The goal wasn't just to prevent theft, it was to ensure that only a Templar trained in the cipher, aware of the protocols, could verify and redeem the note. Most letters had a lifespan. Some were valid only for a season, others for a year. A few were open-ended, particularly those issued to ranking clergy or nobility. And unlike promissory notes, these weren't loans. The Templars didn't promise to pay at a future date. They promised to pay now somewhere else. The subtle genius of it lay in the mobility of value without the movement of metal. One curious account from a merchant's journal in Palermo describes a transaction involving two separate letters of credit, both issued by Templar houses in different regions. The merchant was able to use one to offset the other, a sort of early cancellation of debts via matched letters. This hints at a more advanced system than previously assumed. Some modern scholars believe the Templars operated what we might now call an internal clearinghouse, reconciling credits and debits across their network to maintain balance. If that's true, it would predate similar practices in Renaissance banking by at least a century. Naturally, there were limits. These letters were only honored within the Templar network. Present one to a Genoese banker or a Florentine trader, and they'd shrug. But present it at a Templar preceptory, even one 1,000 miles away, and it would be accepted without question. This internal exclusivity made the system resilient but opaque. No one outside the order knew the true scale of credits in circulation. It's possible even the Grand Master didn't have a full picture. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these letters ever bore interest. The official line is no to charge interest was to risk the sin of usury explicitly condemned by the Church. But some documents hint at service fees, handling charges, and administrative deductions. The language is careful, even evasive. Did the Templars find clever ways to bend the rules? Almost certainly. But did they technically break them? That depends on which canon lawyer you ask. More intriguing still is the matter of unclaimed credit. What happened when a bearer died before redeeming his letter, or when a transaction was lost in transit? Some commanderies kept careful records of such events, suggesting that unclaimed funds were held for years or quietly absorbed into the general treasury. In at least one case from Navarre, we find a letter sent from a grieving widow to a Templar preceptor, asking if her husband's deposit might be returned. The reply, preserved in a local archive, confirms that the funds had already been redeployed to the service of the Holy Land. Diplomatic, but final. There's also the matter of forgery. As the Templar system grew in sophistication, so did the efforts to breach it. The seals were forged, the handwriting mimicked. Even the parchment types were studied. But the order adapted. Letters were increasingly countersigned by multiple officials. In some regions, colored threads were woven into the folds. And in the Paris Temple, it's believed a special register was maintained, a master list of all active credits known only to a handful of trusted brothers. If that register ever existed, it is now lost. We might be tempted to view these letters as primitive checks or medieval credit cards, but that underestimates their psychological power. These documents weren't just tools of finance, they were passports to safety. In a fragmented, dangerous world, carrying one of these letters marked you as someone protected by the most powerful religious military order in Europe. It conferred status. It dissuaded thieves. And more than once, it saved lives. Still, the system couldn't escape the limitations of its age. Communication was slow. Cancellations were rare. Mistakes once made were hard to undo. And unlike modern banks, the Templars had no recourse to centralized enforcement. A dispute in Acre might not reach Paris for months. And if a preceptor vanished to war plague or scandal, so too might the record of any credits he held. All of which raises a deeper question: how much of this system depended not on process, but on belief that the order would endure. Belief that your letter would be honored. Belief that the temple, for all its mystery, was ultimately trustworthy. Because when that belief was shattered, the paper promises turned to ash. Behind every grand system lies a quiet machinery of numbers. For the Templars, that machinery ran not on gears and oil, but on quills, ledgers, and silence. While the warriors of the Temple clashed with Saracens in the Levant, a different kind of battle was being fought in the commanderies won against chaos, miscalculation, and loss. To manage a financial network stretching from Portugal to Palestine, the Templars had to create something radical for their time-consistent accounting. In an age where most records were fragmented, local, and idiosyncratic, the idea of a standardized financial language was almost heretical. Monasteries recorded income in annals. Royal treasuries kept ledgers if they were lucky, but they varied wildly in style, currency, and notation. The Templars, however, needed unity. They couldn't afford a scribe in Antioch using different valuation methods than one in Toulouse. So they devised protocols. Not laws exactly, there's no surviving Templar financial codebook. But the evidence suggests they trained their clerks across regions to use shared practices. This training likely happened at major commanderies such as the Paris Temple, which functioned not only as a treasury, but also as a central administrative school. Novices sent to manage estates or ledgers would have received instruction in how to keep inventory, record tithes, log incoming deposits, and crucially balance disbursements. Though few documents survive intact, surviving fragments from England, Aragon and Cyprus use remarkably similar formats: tables drawn with inked lines, headings in Latin, consistent abbreviations for commodities like grain wool and silver. In one especially well-preserved fragment from Provence dating to around 1267, we find evidence of double-entry principles, or at least a rudimentary version. It lists the same transaction twice, once under receipts, once under disbursements, with marginal notes for where the offsetting item was to be found. This isn't quite Venetian accounting, the gold standard, that would come a century later, but it's tantalizingly close. Enough to suggest that the Templars were thinking in terms of balance, not just lists. One particularly obscure detail from this same record offers a quiet shock: a column labeled "Deferatur ad alia domum," to be deferred to another house. In other words, deferred entries. The implication: the Templars were not only tracking income and spending, but planning for delayed recognition of funds. That's advanced. That's modern. and it's buried in the back pages of a monastery's storage room. There's an ongoing debate among historians about whether these accounting methods were imposed top-down or developed regionally and later harmonized. Some argue that the Grand Master's court issued instructions, likely in encoded letters, to standardize record-keeping. Others believe regional masters shared best practices through correspondence and meetings. Either way, the end result was a system that allowed wealth to be tracked across vast distances with a surprising degree of consistency. Of course, standardization had its limits. Local currencies still varied, as did weights and measures. To compensate, Templar scribes often recorded values in multiple units, the local coin, plus a standard base currency, likely denarii or livres tournois, depending on the region. This dual entry helped the order compare holdings across territories, adjust for fluctuations, and estimate true value. It's a headache for modern translators, but a stroke of genius for 13th century asset management. What's less well known is how this system may have impacted their downfall. During the arrests of 1307, French officials seized vast quantities of Templar property. In many cases, they expected to find overflowing treasuries. What they found instead were books, not treasure chests, but records. Documents listing obligations, credits, notes, receivable, in short, a paper trail that meant little to those outside the system. One frustrated official even wrote they held less gold than parchment. What he didn't realize was that the real wealth had never been in the vaults. And yet, there's a mystery here. If the Templars maintained such robust accounting practices, where are the ledgers now? A few scattered fragments survive, yes. But the comprehensive records, the lifeblood of their system, have vanished. Some believe they were burned during the arrests, destroyed by frightened brothers, hoping to protect clients. Others suggest the records were seized, buried in church archives, or quietly appropriated by the institutions that replaced the order. It's the quietest vanishing act in financial history. And yet, echoes remain. In the account books of early Italian banks, in the phrasing of monastic inventories from the 14th century, in the structural logic behind Renaissance bookkeeping. You don't need a complete ledger to see the outline of the hand that held the pen. All of this returns us to an idea already forming: the Templars weren't improvising. They weren't guessing. Their financial system was deliberate, evolving, and resilient, and it depended not on gold or glory, but on one very human thing: record-keeping. Because in the end, it wasn't just the sword that built an empire. It was the ledger. Picture a thick-walled commandery tucked behind stone ramparts, its banner snapping in the wind. Outside, pilgrims pass on worn roads. Inside, chests lie hidden beneath flagstones, and keys are stored in iron rings worn on belts like sacred totems. This was the image of safety the Templars cultivated, guardians of wealth, sworn to poverty, untouched by worldly temptation. But behind that facade of spiritual duty, a more complicated reality stirred. Were these vaults just safe storage, or something far more daring? At first glance, the Templars appear to have operated as glorified safety deposit boxes. A noble would entrust a purse of coins, a deed, a jeweled crucifix, and the order would guard it without question, without apparent fee. And in many cases, that's exactly what they did. Testimonies from early 13th century notaries in Avignon and Bordeaux speak of guardianship deposits made to the temple for safekeeping, often sealed and witnessed, especially during times of war or succession. The Templars' reputation made them ideal custodians. They weren't greedy, they didn't flee battle, and above all, they didn't owe loyalty to any regional power. But a few things don't quite add up. For instance, there's the issue of storage space. Some surviving inventories from large commanderies like those in Paris or La Rochelle list dozens of keys, strong boxes, and sealed compartments. Yet when you tally the property known to have been deposited at these sites, the numbers seem mismatched. Either the Templars were vastly overprepared, or they were holding far more than official records admit. There's even one chronicle largely overlooked from a Flemish clerk in 1271 who noted that when he deposited 2 sealed bags in the Paris temple, he wasn't given a receipt. Instead, he was told, "The name is enough." The implication, an informal, even confidential layer to the service, one that didn't rely on paperwork. This informality raises uncomfortable questions. Could the Templars have been operating at least in part like private bankers, discreet, silent, selective? After all, the boundary between custodianship and lending is thin. A chest of silver held for one lord could in theory be temporarily borrowed to finance a caravan, a grain shipment, or a garrison's pay, provided it was restored before the withdrawal was requested. There's no hard evidence of this behavior, but hints ripple through the historical record. Take, for example, a curious complaint lodged by a minor noble in Poitou in 1290. He claimed his funds entrusted to the temple had not been made available in due time, and further alleged that the Templars had used them in their commerce. No formal investigation followed. The complaint vanished into silence, but the wording, especially that last phrase, is haunting. What commerce historians are divided. Some argue these were isolated misunderstandings. Others suspect the Templars had developed an early form of fractional reserve banking, lending out a portion of their held wealth, confident not all clients would demand withdrawals at once. It's speculation, but not unreasonable. The liquidity needed to fund crusader campaigns, supply lines, and mercenary contracts had to come from somewhere. And the more wealth they held for others, the more tempting it became to make that wealth move. One obscure reference from a Venetian trading manual dated 1284 may support this. It describes guarantees of the temple being used to underwrite a shipment of spices across the Adriatic. The Templars had no direct stake in the cargo, but their name, their seal, had apparently functioned as a form of insurance. That's not mere storage. That's underwriting. If true, this would place the Templars centuries ahead of their time. Long before the Medici issued complex bills of exchange, long before Rothschild networks spanned Europe, the Knights of the Temple may have been quietly engaging in financial activity most modern minds would immediately recognize as banking, just without the name. But this secrecy was a double-edged sword. Their lack of transparency, so useful in earning the trust of elites, made them easy targets for suspicion. What are they doing with all that gold, the kings wondered. Why are they exempt from taxation, from inspection? And the answer, never quite spoken, was that they answered to no one but themselves and God, which to a power-hungry monarch like Philip IV of France sounded less like piety and more like defiance. It's here that we must acknowledge a fundamental ambiguity. Were the Templars simply safeguarding wealth until it was claimed, or were they actively managing investing and moving it to serve their own agenda? The documents don't say. The records are mostly gone, and those that remain are cautious, vague, sometimes eerily silent. But the architecture tells its own story. Rooms with triple locks, trapdoors beneath chapels, corridors that led nowhere or perhaps somewhere very carefully hidden. These were not just monks with keys. They were something stranger, something quietly revolutionary. And in the end, perhaps the most dangerous idea they held was not what they stored, but what they enabled: the movement of money unbound by borders, unchecked by kings, and ultimately answerable only to the order. The medieval church had a complicated relationship with money. Charging interest on a loan usura was not merely frowned upon. It was condemned, anathematized, and associated with the corruption of the soul. A good Christian did not make money from money. And yet, wars had to be funded, pilgrimages supported, fortresses repaired. Somehow capital had to flow. The Templars lived at the uneasy intersection of morality and necessity. As a religious order, they were bound by canon law to avoid usury. But as an international financial entity, they faced daily situations that, by modern standards, look very much like interest-bearing loans. How did they reconcile the two? The answer is part theology, part technicality, and part sleight of hand. To begin, we must understand how the Church defined usury. It wasn't simply about profit, it was about excess. Lending money with the expectation of gain, particularly gain derived from time alone, was sinful, but charging fees for services rendered acceptable. Being compensated for risk labor or storage permissible if framed correctly. The Templars learned quickly how to phrase their financial operations in ways that sidestepped theological scrutiny. A loan wasn't a loan, it was an advance against future compensation. A fee wasn't interest, it was a handling charge, a penalty for delay, or a service to the Church. In many cases, they didn't even need to spell it out. Their clients understood. So did their scribes. Everyone agreed to maintain the fiction. One well-preserved example comes from a 1243 record in Limoges. A local merchant deposited a large sum with the temple, requesting that it be forwarded to Acre in 3 installments. The Templars complied, but withheld a portion from each transfer. When questioned, they stated that the deductions were for the expenses of safe conveyance, trusted couriers, and the preservation of the donor's intent. No interest was named, but the total deducted matched what would have been a 7% return, remarkably close to what other moneylenders offered under the table. There's also the case of delayed repayment. When the Templars lent money, say to a baron preparing for a crusade, they often attached conditions. Not about profit, but about timing. Repayment had to occur within a span not exceeding 2 winters, or else additional obligations would be incurred. The language danced around the concept of interest, but the effect was the same: a late repayment cost more. Some historians argue this was nothing more than clever accounting moral gymnastics performed to maintain a pious image. But others see something more interesting. They suggest that the Templars were early pioneers of risk-based pricing. If a region was war-torn, if a borrower was politically unstable, the fees were higher. If the funds were transferred quickly and with minimal handling costs were lower. In short, they were adapting financial behavior to market conditions, all while avoiding the word that would have condemned them: usury. This maneuvering did not go unnoticed. There are at least 2 surviving letters from 13th century bishops accusing the Templars of veiled profiteering. One from the Bishop of Girona accuses the order of acting as merchants in the guise of monks and demands a review of their ledgers. The Templars responded politely, vaguely, stating that their actions were in the service of Christ's cause and therefore beyond reproach. No further inquiry was made. The most revealing clue, perhaps, comes from the Church's silence. Despite their visibility, their volume of transactions, and their enormous reach, the Templars were rarely prosecuted for financial misconduct. Lesser bankers, Jewish moneylenders, Lombard merchants were routinely harassed or exiled. But the Temple endured. One could interpret this as favoritism, or perhaps more cynically, as convenience. The Church itself used Templar services. Bishops deposited funds. Papal legates withdrew coin in foreign lands. Even the Pope relied on the Temple's infrastructure. And here lies the contradiction. The Templars had created a financial model that served the Church's needs while violating its principles in everything but name. It was, in a way, a sacred compromise. As long as the money flowed, and as long as the books were written in the right words, no one asked too many questions. This careful balancing act recalls a detail from earlier, the letters of credit and their carefully constructed phrasing. They weren't just tools of security, they were shields of language. Each term, each phrase carefully crafted to remain theologically safe. It's a practice that resonates here again in their financial dealings. A shared instinct across the order: hide the truth in plain sight behind the right words. But this delicate game came at a cost. When the political tides turned, those same evasions were weaponized against them. Secret profits, hidden treasuries, unjust, gained. The accusations that swirled around the Templars in their final years were not random. They were rooted in a growing unease. How could an order that claimed poverty wield so much quiet wealth? And so the same mechanisms that had shielded them, the euphemisms, the sealed ledgers, the blurred lines between storage and lending, became sources of suspicion, not because they had failed, but because they had worked too well. It was one thing for a noble to deposit a purse of coin with the Templars. It was another for a king to hand them his treasury. And yet they did more than once. By the late 13th century, monarchs across Europe were not just patrons of the Knights Templar. They were clients, quiet ones, often secretive, always strategic. These were not donations for the salvation of souls. These were practical arrangements, political ones, financial lifelines wrapped in the flag of the temple. The English crown was among the earliest and most consistent users of Templar services. Records from the reign of Henry III show frequent references to our treasure kept with the Brothers of the Temple, with amounts sometimes reaching into the tens of thousands of pounds, staggering sums for the time. These funds weren't just idle. They were managed, guarded, and in many cases deployed at the king's command. The temple in London, strategically positioned near the heart of royal power, functioned as both a vault and a discreet administrative office. Nobles came and went. Messengers carried sealed notes. And through it all, the Templars remained silent. But it was in France that the relationship turned intimate and dangerous. Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, relied heavily on the Paris temple to store and manage his royal treasury. The arrangement suited him. The Templars were efficient, incorruptible, and most crucially, outside the reach of his rivals. At a time when competing factions threatened his power and foreign creditors circled hungrily, the temple offered something the crown itself could not: stability. According to chronicles from the time, Philip's gold and much of his minting equipment was physically housed in the Paris temple. When riots threatened the royal palace, Philip allegedly moved to the temple for safety. It was a fortress, after all, a sanctuary, but also perhaps a gilded cage. Because in entrusting his wealth to the Templars, the king may have come to a troubling realization: he no longer controlled the machinery of his own state. And that is where the suspicion began. There are references in later depositions given under torture, it must be said, that speak of accounts without names, chambers within chambers, and hidden balances not known to the king. These may have been exaggerations, confessions extracted to suit an agenda. But they point to a broader fear that the Templars were not simply storing royal funds. They were managing them independently. One courtier even referred to the temple as a kingdom within the kingdom. Whether literal or not, the phrase stuck. It captured the growing anxiety of secular rulers who realized they were no longer the sole masters of their financial domains. The Templars answered to no crown, and yet they held the coin that made kingdoms move. There's a small, easily missed document from Aragon dated 1289 that reinforces this. It details a loan to the crown facilitated by the Templars, but with repayment terms set not by the king, but by the grand preceptor of the region. The note includes a clause stating that adjustments may be made should the needs of the Holy Land exceed expectation. That phrase is loaded. It suggests that even royal debts could be subordinated to the order's own priorities. It's worth pausing to consider how revolutionary and how dangerous that arrangement was. No other institution at the time had the power to tell a king, "You'll be repaid, unless we need the money more." And yet kings returned, again and again. Because the alternative, relying on local barons' fragmented treasuries or foreign bankers, was worse. The Templars were efficient, quiet, and most importantly, they never betrayed a client, until their arrest made silence impossible. There is a haunting callback here to earlier themes: the coded letters of credit, the sealed deposits, the ambiguous fees. It's a pattern, a way of doing business cloaked in ritual but shaped by necessity. The same principles applied to royal clients, just on a larger scale. The question that continues to puzzle historians is how much autonomy the Templars actually exercised over royal accounts. Did they invest the money? Did they leverage it to underwrite other operations? Or did they hold it inert like obedient vault keepers? The truth is elusive. Most financial records from the temple, especially those related to royal clients, vanished in the wake of their downfall. And perhaps that's no accident, because in the end, the very trust that brought kings to the temple also made the Templars vulnerable. When the political winds shifted, their silence was reinterpreted as secrecy. Their efficiency became manipulation, their independence, treason. The same kings who once entrusted their gold would come to demand blood. It's often said that trust is built slowly and destroyed in a moment. But in the case of Philip IV of France and the Knights Templar, trust wasn't simply broken. It was weaponized. By the dawn of the 14th century, the French crown was tangled in debts wars and spiraling administrative costs. Philip IV, a calculating and pragmatic ruler, had already squeezed traditional sources of revenue to their limits. He had taxed the clergy, confiscated Jewish property, and debased the currency more than once. And yet it wasn't enough. The machinery of the state needed oil, and the oil was money. Where could a king turn when the royal coffers echoed hollow to the temple? The Templars had long operated in France with the king's blessing. Their Paris commandery stood like a stone heart in the city's center, ringed by high walls, with its own guards, its own records, and its own rules. It was in effect a city within a city, and Philip had grown uncomfortably reliant on it. There are multiple records from the late 1290s indicating that the temple in Paris served as the effective royal treasury. One missive from a court clerk refers to a withdrawal authorized by His Majesty to be taken from the temple's vault, phrased not as a loan, but as an entitlement, as if the Templars were merely holding the king's wealth, not managing it. But that framing is misleading. In truth, the lines had blurred. Some scholars believed that Philip had not only stored state revenues with the Templars, but also used their system to conduct sensitive financial transfers, payments to mercenaries, bribes to foreign courts, and possibly even secret loans masked as deposits. None of this was illegal. None of it was public either. And that secrecy became its own liability. Philip's relationship with the order soured for reasons both personal and political. He had quarreled with Pope Boniface VIII, resented the Church's wealth, and faced growing internal dissent. The Templars, with their tax exemptions, cross-border power, and aloof silence, became a target too tempting to ignore. But Philip couldn't simply attack them without cause. Not publicly. Not yet. So he continued to borrow. Quietly. Increasingly. One estimate extrapolated from what little remains of royal ledgers suggests that in the 5 years leading up to 1307, Philip IV may have drawn more from the temple than from any other institution, ecclesiastical or secular. He was in effect held afloat by the very order he would soon accuse of heresy. And this is where the dependency turns dark, because Philip was not a man to tolerate debt. In 1306, he expelled the Jews from France, canceling all debts owed to them in a single stroke. That same year, he increased pressure on the Church to fund his administration. But the Templars remained elusive, independent, protected by papal privilege, and unwilling to bow. There is a chilling detail in a letter written by Guillaume de Nogaret, one of Philip's closest advisors. It references the order as a treasury that answers to no man, a shadow state within our borders. It is the language of fear, but also of envy. For Nogaret and the king, the Templars had ceased to be allies. They had become rivals. It's important to recall the earlier theme of royal clients. Kings had used the temple as a vault, a transfer hub, even a bank, but always under the assumption that the order was loyal. Philip's realization that the Templars' loyalty ran to the Pope, not the crown, marked a turning point. In his eyes, they were no longer just useful. They were dangerous. The irony, of course, is that the very efficiency that had made the temple indispensable also made them vulnerable. Their records were meticulous, their procedures standardized, their reach continental, all of which made it easy to imagine that behind the walls of the Paris commandery lay untold treasure and perhaps even deeper secrets. When Philip finally acted in October 1307, arresting every Templar he could lay hands on, it was presented as a moral crusade. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, and unnatural vice filled the air. But behind the spectacle lay a simpler motive: control. Control over wealth, control over narrative, and perhaps most urgently, control over a debt that had grown intolerable. Modern historians continue to debate the exact financial picture in the months leading up to the arrests. How much did Philip owe the temple? What assets were seized? Were the vaults emptied in advance? Or did they hold only ledgers and receipts, as some reports suggest? The records are fragmentary, deliberately so. What remains, however, is the unmistakable impression that the king's dependence had reached a critical point. The temple wasn't just holding his money, it was holding his confidence, his sovereignty, his myth. And that for Philip IV was a debt too great to bear. By the time Philip IV issued the order to arrest the Templars in 1307, a darker fear had taken root in the minds of Europe's monarchs, not just that the Templars held wealth, but that they held power, and not the kind bestowed by crowns or charters. This was something more elusive, more threatening, a financial sovereignty beyond the grasp of any one ruler. The Templars answered to no king. That was written into their very DNA. From the moment of their foundation, they were placed under the direct authority of the Pope. This gave them sweeping privileges, the right to move freely across borders, to maintain their own courts, even to collect tithes in some cases. But perhaps the most important of these immunities was fiscal. They were exempt from taxation. Their revenues flowed unimpeded, their assets legally untouchable. For a 13th century ruler trying to assert control over his realm's economy, this was intolerable. It wasn't just about treasure hidden in vaults. It was about the inability to see shape or tax the flow of money itself. And the Templars, quietly and efficiently, were becoming a financial entity unto themselves. One episode in Castile, circa 1281, reveals the tension clearly. King Alfonso II issued a decree attempting to tax all religious orders operating in his domain. The Templars refused. In a letter to the crown, the regional master stated that they were under no obligation to remit tribute, invoking papal authority and the defense of the Holy Land as justification. Alfonso backed down. He had no leverage. The order's lands were fortified, its accounts hidden, and its loyalties pledged elsewhere. But perhaps the most dramatic evidence of this autonomy comes from Hungary. In 1297, a dispute erupted between local lords and the Templars over grain prices. The Templars had purchased large quantities from peasant farmers, allegedly at below-market rates, and stockpiled it in their granaries. When prices rose during a drought, the order refused to release the grain at the rate the crown demanded. The conflict escalated into violence. A skirmish outside a Templar house left 2 men dead. And yet when the king demanded compensation, the order responded with a calm deflection. They would answer only to Rome. This was the essence of their power. Not rebellion, not open defiance, but refusal through hierarchy. Kings could bluster, but the Templars belonged to a higher chain of command. It's here that the real threat begins to emerge, because for all their vows of humility, the order had grown into a sovereign financial system. Their lands paid them. Their clients enriched them. Their vaults shielded wealth from secular reach. And no matter how much a king needed their help, he could never quite own them. There's a whisper of this in a complaint filed by a Sicilian courtier in 1302. He referred to the temple as a coin without a face, a strange phrase but potent. The implication was that the order had become its own currency. It existed outside the normal symbols of authority. No royal bust on a coin, no seal of the crown on a charter, just the red cross and the word of the brothers. Some scholars believe that by this time the Templars were functionally acting as an independent financial jurisdiction. They maintained their own schedules of debt and credit. They applied their own internal penalties. They could and did delay repayments to nobles, even kings, if they deemed it necessary. There's no surviving ledger proving this, but enough circumstantial evidence to build a compelling case. And yet, with such independence came vulnerability. Because what kings could not control, they could fear. And what they feared, they could accuse. The earlier chapters revealed the growing unease around the temple's financial techniques, the letters of credit, the storage that might not have been storage, the quiet ways fees replaced interest. That unease deepened when monarchs realized they couldn't command the full picture. They couldn't audit the order. They couldn't even get a clear answer about how much money was where or who had access to it. To a mind like Philip IV's, that wasn't just arrogance, it was subversion. It's no coincidence that the accusations launched against the Templars during their arrests focused on secrecy, betrayal, and false allegiance. Beneath the theological theater, the claims of spitting on the cross and idolatrous rituals, there was a deeper concern that the Templars had created a second authority. Not one of swords and banners, but of ledgers and locks. A realm of money that could not be taxed, tracked, or seized by royal decree. And in that shadow realm, kings became clients, which meant they were not truly kings. This realization shattered the fragile trust that had allowed the temple to flourish. What had once been its greatest strength, independence, became the grounds for its destruction. Because in a world where kings were supposed to reign supreme, the Templars had built something else entirely. A system that didn't need a throne, just numbers, walls, and silence. If the kings of Europe found the Templars intolerable, the Church found them inconvenient. Useful, yes. Pious in image, formidable in battle, dependable in finance, but also troubling. Because over the course of 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had become something rare and hard to contain, a religious order that operated like a sovereign institution. And their wealth. It was no longer just property. It was power. From the very beginning, the Templars enjoyed papal favor. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the bull Omni Datum Optimum, which granted the order sweeping privileges, exemption from local taxes, freedom from episcopal authority, and the right to build their own oratories, chapels they could staff, control, and use for profit. It was a blank check dressed in sanctity. And over time it became the foundation for a system that allowed the Templars to bypass nearly all conventional religious oversight. Their income was immense. Donations poured in from nobles and monarchs. They owned farmland, mills, fisheries, vineyards, even entire villages. And none of it was tithed to local bishops. The money stayed within the order, circulated, invested, repurposed. A bishop might struggle to fund the repair of a cathedral roof, while the Templars in the same diocese quietly built a new granary or reinforced a wall. Resentment simmered. But speaking out was dangerous. The Temple answered only to Rome, and Rome for most of the 12th and 13th centuries had bigger concerns: schisms, heresies, wars in Italy, and a constantly shifting relationship with secular powers. The Templars were for the most part left alone. Not because the Church approved of everything they did, but because it was politically inconvenient to rein them in. That unease eventually seeped into official language. Some papal letters from the late 1200s adopt a cooler tone. One refers to the overabundant liberty of the Templars. Another asks, not commands, just asks that they share their wealth more visibly in service to the poor. These are veiled criticisms, carefully wrapped in diplomatic phrasing, but they betray an anxiety that the order was slipping beyond its spiritual moorings. There's a telling moment in 1274 during the Second Council of Lyon. Among the many matters debated was the idea of merging the Templars and the Hospitallers, the two great military orders, into a single body. Officially, the goal was efficiency. Unofficially, it was about control. A unified order would be easier to supervise. But the Templars resisted. Politely, firmly, and ultimately successfully, they remained separate. And that perhaps was the moment the Church realized just how ungovernable they had become. Behind the scenes, individual bishops continued to complain. A letter from the Archbishop of Rouen to a cardinal in Rome describes the Temple's local commandery as a realm apart, where no sermon is heard and no tithe is given. That letter, dated 1291, ends with a phrase that now reads like a quiet warning: if they are not guided, they will guide. Still, the Vatican did nothing. Why some suggest complicity, the popes, especially during the Crusades, relied on Templar logistics to move money, messages, and men. The Temple's infrastructure made papal authority real in places where it otherwise might have faltered. To alienate them would have been to weaken the very idea of Christendom. Others argue it was about plausible deniability. As long as the Temple operated within a haze of religious legitimacy, the Church could benefit from its strength while avoiding responsibility for its methods. And then there's the financial entanglement. The papacy itself made use of Templar services, funds collected from across Europe. Crusading taxes, indulgence payments, land rents were often held transferred or even disbursed by the order. One surviving record from 1296 shows the Templars delivering 3,000 livres tournois to the papal legate in Sicily. No guards, no fanfare, just a sealed pouch, a nod, and a departure. The Templars were the Church's quiet accountants and sometimes its bankers. So when Philip IV accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and secret sins, the Pope hesitated. Clement V, newly installed and politically vulnerable, found himself caught between an ambitious king and a powerful order. His initial response was cautious. He called for inquiry, not condemnation. He questioned the arrests. He asked for evidence. But pressure mounted. Philip's propaganda spread. Torture extracted confessions, and eventually silence gave way to acquiescence. In 1312, under enormous duress, Clement V dissolved the order, not by declaring them guilty that would have set a dangerous precedent, but by stating that their reputation had become too tarnished to continue. It was a diplomatic execution. Looking back, the Church's silence was not born of ignorance. It was born of compromise. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had operated in a gray space between vow and vault, between altar and account. And the Church, however, uneasily had accepted it. But when the political costs grew too high, Rome turned away. Not with fury, not with clarity, just absence. A final callback lingers here: the sealed letters, the untraceable accounts, the faceless loans to kings. The same ambiguity that had protected the temple from external control now made it indefensible in a court of public opinion. Because in the end, what the Church couldn't explain, it chose not to defend. Stone by stone, mile by mile, the Templars built their empire, not with cathedrals or palaces, but with a web of fortresses, farms, outposts, and discreet commanderies that formed the arteries of their financial body. Unlike royal castles designed for grandeur or monasteries made for contemplation, these structures were utilitarian, fortified, and deliberately obscure. From the windswept coast of Ireland to the sun-bleached plains of Cyprus, the order's infrastructure pulsed quietly, invisibly, efficiently. To the average traveler, a Templar site might seem modest. A square chapel, a few barns, a fortified hall with narrow windows and thick doors. But each site had a purpose, and many had multiple lives. A house in Provence might host pilgrims by day and store coin by night. A vineyard in Gascony might fund military operations in the Levant, and a seemingly forgotten grange in northern England might serve as a rendezvous point for messengers traveling south with sealed letters tucked beneath their cloaks. This wasn't coincidence. It was design. The Templar presence in Europe wasn't scattered randomly. It followed trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and coastal hubs. They built near rivers and roads, near ports and passes, and wherever they built, they connected. The commanderies spoke to one another, not with telegraphs or bells, but with riders, with ciphered messages, with predictable schedules. Every 3 weeks, a rider from the Champagne region might depart for Paris with account summaries. Every quarter, funds might be transferred not in gold, but in the form of parchment and trust. And beneath all of this ran an unspoken truth: the physical infrastructure of the order was the financial system. There were no glass towers or banking halls. The grain stored in their silos could be converted to coin. The wool from their sheep became trade currency. Even their watermills, hundreds of them across the continent, generated profit that entered their ledgers like clockwork. A remarkable detail survives from an inventory conducted in 1306 at a Templar estate in Languedoc. It lists 18 horses, 24 pigs, 6 barrels of salted fish, and rather surprisingly, a locked room containing 6 bundles of parchment, a weighing scale, and 3 iron boxes, contents unknown. The phrasing is frustratingly vague, but those bundles likely contained financial records, maybe deposit slips, maybe coded notes. The iron boxes, possibly coin, possibly bonds, possibly something else. What's curious is how consistent such setups were across regions. A 1298 record from a German preceptory describes an almost identical storage space, locked, sealed, accessed only by 2 key holders in the presence of a third witness. It suggests standard operating procedures, a form of institutional memory not often seen in the medieval world. And this consistency, this quiet, nearly invisible professionalism, is part of why the order could function across thousands of kilometers without losing control. There's also the matter of the roads. The Templars maintained their own paths, not paved, not guarded by tolls, but informally recognized by those who mattered. Merchants knew to avoid interfering with Templar riders. Local lords, even those hostile to the church, often let their messengers pass unhindered. Some of this was fear, some of it was respect, but most of it was calculation. The Templars weren't just soldiers. They were part of the machinery that kept Europe turning, paying ransoms, transferring coins, smoothing trade. And at the heart of all this silence, the order rarely advertised its movements. It rarely explained its facilities. Many of its commanderies, particularly in rural France and Iberia, didn't even display the Red Cross. They looked like farmhouses or lonely towers or half-forgotten chapels. But behind those doors, letters were opened, keys turned, and the quiet hum of the temple's financial engine continued. One persistent rumor, impossible to verify, speaks of an underground vault beneath the Paris temple with a tunnel leading to the Seine. The idea being that should the need arise, records and wealth could be loaded onto barges in secret and moved under the cover of night. There's no physical proof this tunnel ever existed, but its persistence in the lore speaks volumes. The Templars were expected to be prepared for anything, even vanishing. This brings us back to a key idea: control without visibility. The kings who grew dependent on the temple never truly understood how the system worked. They saw the stone walls, the armored guards, the coins when requested. But they didn't see the messages, the internal ledgers, the quiet signals passed between preceptors. The infrastructure was real, but so was the obscurity. Every building was both a place and a veil. Which is why when the arrests began in 1307, so many commanders reported confusion. They had no treasure. They had no weapons cache. What they had was stored grain-clean ledgers and ordinary goods. The real machinery had already stopped, or moved, or perhaps simply vanished behind the very walls no one thought to question. It was the first thing the officials asked when they stormed the Paris temple on that gray October morning in 1307. Where are the books? They expected treasure, yes. Perhaps arms, perhaps relics. But they also expected records documents that would prove the accusations, justify the arrests, or at least explain the sheer scale of the temple's holdings. What they found instead was silence and absence. The disappearance of the Templar ledgers is one of the most enduring mysteries surrounding the order's downfall. For an institution so deeply dependent on record-keeping, the near-total lack of surviving financial documentation is not just odd, it is suspicious. There were ledgers without a doubt. Too many fragments remain receipts, letters of credit, marginal account summaries, for us to believe otherwise. From earlier chapters, we know they tracked deposits, transfers, obligations, even deferred balances. They recorded fees, shipments, land revenues, and they did so across multiple commanderies, often with consistency. These weren't scraps of memory. They were organized, systemic, and vital. And yet, after the arrests, they vanish. What remains are drips of ink in the margins of unrelated documents, a note here, a copied receipt there. There is no master ledger, no final balance sheet, no archive of internal correspondence. It's as if the entire financial brain of the temple was either erased or hidden. The prevailing theory is deliberate destruction. According to several testimonies from detained Templars, some under duress, others given freely, the brothers were warned in the days leading up to the mass arrest. The Grand Master Jacques de Molay may have received word from allies inside the French court. One account suggests that in the early hours of October 13th, bundles of documents were burned in the temple's inner courtyard. No one has found ashes, no one has found fragments. But the timing would explain why, despite extensive confiscations, the authorities never recovered anything close to a complete financial record. If true, this was not just an act of self-preservation. It was a strategic obliteration. Because the Templar books didn't merely contain accounting. They contained secrets, client names, hidden donations, conditions tied to royal loans, perhaps even cross-referenced instructions between regional commanderies, proof of a centralized treasury the authorities had long suspected but never seen. If those documents had fallen into the wrong hands, they could have destroyed not only the temple but many of its noble and royal associates. Another possibility, whispered by a minority of historians, is concealment rather than destruction. In this view, the records weren't burned. They were moved, smuggled out through the very tunnels and couriers the temple had long maintained, taken from Paris and secreted in rural commanderies, perhaps to Cyprus, perhaps to Portugal, where the order's remnants would later rebrand themselves as the Order of Christ. This theory gains traction from the fact that some individual properties, especially in Iberia, continued to be managed efficiently even after the formal dissolution of the order. Someone, it seems, still had access to the old numbers, but the truth remains maddeningly elusive. In the wake of the arrests, Philip IV's officials did conduct inventories of Templar property. These documents exist. Some are dry lists of livestock and grain. Others reference accounting books not found or records previously stored here now missing. One royal agent in Poitiers filed a brief but damning note: no ledgers, only copies of receipts and one missive unsigned. That may be the closest we ever get to an official admission that the books were simply gone. The Church fared no better. When Pope Clement V initiated his own inquiries, he too demanded records. He summoned witnesses. He instructed bishops to secure archives. But the responses were the same: missing, misplaced, unknown. The Templars, it seemed, had either wiped themselves clean or been so ruthlessly efficient that their internal system could not be unraveled without its keys. And perhaps that was the point. In earlier chapters, we saw how the temple's financial system thrived on abstraction, on paper promises, coded correspondence, and trust. Without the ledgers, much of it became unintelligible. A letter of credit was worthless without its counterpart. A debt recorded in cipher had no meaning without the key to decode it. The destruction of the records didn't just erase evidence, it collapsed the system from within. There's a curious irony in this. For an order so often accused of hoarding treasure, their real wealth may have been in information. And when that information disappeared, the illusion shattered. To this day, treasure hunters chase rumors of lost Templar gold. But the scholars, the archivists, the financial historians, they're chasing something else: a missing archive. A vault of knowledge that once spanned continents and now exists only in traces. One final note: a parchment discovered in 2001 in the Vatican's secret archives, long misfiled, refers cryptically to the balance of debts known only to the temple. The phrasing is vague, but the implication is chilling. There may still be records somewhere untouched, unread, and waiting, because in the end, it wasn't the gold that mattered. It was the books. The morning of October 13, 1307 unfolded with unnerving precision. Across France, as church bells tolled and markets opened, agents of King Philip IV simultaneously raided Templar commanderies. The king's secret orders, sealed and timed for maximum shock, were carried out with surgical efficiency. Dozens of knights were arrested before sunrise. Keys were seized. Doors were forced open. Vaults were broken. But as soldiers pushed past altars and smashed open storerooms, a strange pattern emerged. There was no treasure. Not the kind they expected anyway. Chroniclers of the day tell of officials rummaging through chests of documents, weighing sacks of grain, cataloging livestock and tools. Some commanderies had modest reserves of coin, often regional currency, sometimes foreign dinars left behind by pilgrims. But the glittering hoards of gold, the mythic riches whispered of in taverns and courts, they weren't there. In fact, they may never have been. Philip's men had expected physical proof of the accusations. Heretical rituals, idols, perhaps coded records of secret debts. What they found was bureaucracy. Ledgers half-filled written in abbreviated Latin, locked compartments containing receipts, contracts, wax tablets. Valuable, yes, but baffling. One report from the Paris raid, penned by a royal notary, expresses open frustration. They have papers for everything, but none that speak plainly. The man had opened drawers expecting maps of secret holdings, only to find inventories of oats, sheepskin purchases, and shipping schedules. The implication is clear: they had seized an archive, but not the knowledge to interpret it. Even the structures themselves confounded the searchers. The temple in Paris was a fortress, thick-walled, compartmentalized, intentionally obscure. Guards stood at inner doors long after outer ones had been breached, stalling for time. Some documents may have been burned during those hours, others hidden. There are rumors of staircases leading nowhere, false floors, concealed spaces between walls. One chamber, described by an officer as a room with no door, was discovered only by accident when a wall gave way during an inventory. But perhaps the most telling detail comes from a smaller commandery in Champagne. There, officials found a room filled not with gold or relics, but with writing tools, bundles of parchment, several sharpened goose quills, jars of ink carefully sealed. The space was clearly an administrative center, but it was missing its contents. The main desk was bare. A small iron box was empty. When questioned, the preceptor simply said, "It was not mine to show." This quiet resistance repeated across the country. Templar brothers claimed ignorance, claimed obedience to the rule. Some insisted that financial matters were handled elsewhere in Paris, in Poitiers, in Outremer. Others said nothing at all. Under torture, a few confessed to secret rituals, but almost none admitted to hiding treasure. If anything, their statements reinforced the reality that the order's wealth was more ethereal than anyone had imagined. That, perhaps, was the greatest misunderstanding of all. Philip IV had assumed the Templars were a vault, a box full of gold waiting to be broken open. Instead, he found a network, a system. And without the keys, literal and figurative, the system became incomprehensible. Church officials fared no better. Clement V, under pressure to legitimize the king's actions, initiated his own inquiries. Bishops were sent to inspect commanderies, but they too found only fragments, torn pages, obsolete receipts, local grain accounts, donation records with no clear central reference point. The order's inner workings remained maddeningly elusive, and yet despite this confusion, the seizures continued. Lands were confiscated, livestock sold, buildings reassigned to other orders, primarily the Hospitallers. But even as the physical assets were redistributed, the heart of the temple's system remained out of reach. No one could reassemble the financial web. The transfers, the credits, the nuanced interdependencies, all of it dissolved the moment the administrative nodes were dismantled. One small detail, easy to overlook, illustrates this collapse beautifully. In 1309, a Hospitaller commander in Toulouse complained to the Pope that the former Templar house he had taken over was useless in matters of account. He explained that the local funds had vanished. The ledger was illegible, and the network that once supported it, the riders, the messengers, the letters of guarantee, had simply ceased. "The house is a barn," he wrote. "It holds grain, but no memory." That word memory is the key. Because what Philip and Clement had truly seized was a structure without its soul. The knowledge, the processes, the silent rhythms that had made the temple's financial system function were gone. It is a callback to the earlier loss of the ledgers, and a foreshadowing of the myth to come. The more Philip tried to explain the absence of gold, of guilt, of clarity, the more he leaned into spectacle. Trials, torture, public burnings, because the truth was both too dull and too damning. He had not dismantled a treasury. He had killed a language he could not speak. And in the ashes of that language, a question remained. If the Templars' wealth was not held in vaults, then where exactly had it gone? There's a reason the phrase Templar treasure still echoes in popular imagination, a reason it's scrawled across yellowed maps, whispered in conspiracy circles, and buried beneath layers of fiction. But peel back the legend, and the truth becomes something stranger. The real treasure of the Knights Templar may never have been gold at all. It began like most myths in a vacuum. After the arrests of 1307, when Philip IV's agents stormed commanderies across France, they expected riches vast, gleaming, unquestionable. What they found was order bureaucracy and a confounding lack of physical wealth. The vaults were sparse. The chests contained mostly local coin paperwork and items of regional value. There was no central hoard, no motherlode. And yet Philip had promised the church and the nobility that the Templars were hoarding wealth. It became a convenient narrative. Heretics with gold, blasphemers with silver, apostates guarding pagan idols encrusted with jewels. It all sounded believable, or at least useful. But behind it sat a basic political problem. The real riches were either gone or had never existed in the form people imagined. So the story changed. It began to twist. Not long after the suppression of the order, rumors surfaced that the Templars had moved their treasure in the days before the arrests. Some said it was carted out of the Paris temple under cover of darkness, loaded onto wagons, and spirited away toward La Rochelle, the port city on the Atlantic. There, the story goes, it was loaded onto a fleet of ships and vanished. No records of such a convoy exist, no first-hand accounts, and yet the myth refuses to die. Later tales added layers. The treasure had reached Scotland, where it helped fund resistance to English rule. Or it had been taken to Portugal, where the Order of Christ, the Templars' legal successor, absorbed the assets and continued their mission in secret. Other versions claim it was buried beneath Rosslyn Chapel or stashed in cryptic vaults beneath the Vatican itself. Each new iteration made the treasure more mystical. It wasn't just coin, it was knowledge, sacred relics, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, anything and everything that could transform a bank ledger into a prophecy. But the real financial historians, the quiet archivists and scholars, take a different view. They point to something far more mundane and far more interesting. The treasure wasn't lost, it was dispersed. At the time of their suppression, the Templars held an enormous portfolio of land tithes, rents, and debts owed. But these were not portable assets. You couldn't stack a wheat contract into a chest and sail it across the sea. Most of the order's wealth was bound up in systems, in relationships, agreements, letters of credit, and a sprawling web of administrative control. The gold wasn't in a vault. It was in movement. One rare but revealing record from the Crown of Aragon, dated 1310, describes the transfer of Templar lands to the Hospitallers. Included is a list of goods formerly pledged in trust, which amounts to little more than household tools, livestock, and a few silver chalices. The real value, the document notes, almost offhandedly, has already passed into other hands. It's never explained which hands, or when, This passive phrasing points back to the earlier chapters, the ones dealing with royal clients, missing ledgers, and the order's infrastructure. If the treasure had been stored in account balances and invisible instruments of exchange, then its disappearance makes perfect sense. Seizing it would have required not force but understanding. And understanding was in short supply. The lack of clarity allowed the myth to grow. It helped distract from the truth that Philip's great seizure yielded far less than hoped. It also helped sell the narrative that justified torture and execution. If there was no treasure, perhaps there was guilt. If not guilt, then sorcery, heresy. Anything to explain the order's fall without admitting the truth that the king had destroyed a system he didn't comprehend. Of course, the myth has its uses. It's easier to hunt for buried gold than to trace centuries-old letters of credit. Easier to imagine a secret fleet than to piece together scattered inventories. The treasure becomes a metaphor for power lost for knowledge, suppressed for a kind of order that dared to exist outside the realm of kings. And yet a quiet question lingers past between archivists like a candle in a dark room. What if the treasure wasn't a myth? What if something was moved? Some core reserve, some last-ditch effort to preserve the heart of the system? We don't know. We may never know. But what we do know is this: the Templars built a financial engine that didn't need to hoard gold. It only needed to move it, redirect it, abstract it. Their treasure wasn't buried beneath a chapel or hidden in a chest. It was written in code, scattered in books, and entrusted to memory. And once those were gone, the treasure vanished with them. When the Templars fell, their buildings didn't crumble. Their lands weren't swallowed by the earth. And their financial system, the network of deposits, transfers, and trust that spanned from the English fens to the ports of Acre, didn't disappear in a puff of smoke. It was too useful, too embedded, too quietly essential to be destroyed outright. So piece by piece it was absorbed. The order's dissolution in 1312 left behind a logistical vacuum. Hundreds of commanderies, thousands of acres, and perhaps most importantly, an invisible infrastructure for managing and moving wealth. The Church, ever pragmatic, saw little reason to let such machinery rust. Most of the temple's European holdings were transferred to the Hospitallers, another military religious order, under the bull Ad Providam. Officially, this transfer was a matter of charity. Unofficially, it was about continuity. But the Hospitallers were not the Templars. Their priorities differed. Their administrative style was less centralized. And while they took the lands, the buildings, and the livestock, they struggled to replicate the temple's financial fluency. In region after region, Hospitaller reports from the early 14th century complain of confusing accounts, missing books, and incomplete records. These weren't just technical difficulties. They were signs that the knowledge, the how, of Templar finance had not been passed down with the property. So where did it go? One compelling answer lies in the hands of those who had once worked for the Templars, the clerks, stewards, scribes, and lay brothers who had been the true engines of their system. While the leadership of the order was imprisoned, tortured, or executed, many of the rank-and-file administrators were quietly released. Some were absorbed into local dioceses, others fled to sympathetic lords, and some were hired. There's a revealing letter from 1313 in which a French nobleman writes to his cousin in Avignon seeking a man learned in the customs of the temple to oversee our accounts. The phrasing suggests more than simple bookkeeping. It suggests a known method, a system worth retaining, one that was now in high demand. It's easy to imagine former Templar clerks spreading across Europe offering their expertise, teaching their methods, and embedding the order's financial logic into new institutions. Italy offers perhaps the clearest view of this process. In cities like Florence, Genoa, and Venice, emerging merchant banks began formalizing practices that strongly resemble Templar innovations: double-entry bookkeeping credit instruments, long-distance transfers, and even notarial secrecy. While direct lineage is hard to prove, the timing aligns. The rapid evolution of Italian banking in the decades after 1312 may not have been coincidence, it may have been inheritance. Portugal presents an even more direct case. There, the Templars were not dissolved in any meaningful way. Instead, they were rebranded. In 1319, at the request of King Denis, Pope John XIII approved the creation of the Ordem de Cristo, the Order of Christ, composed largely of former Templars. The new order retained much of the old one's infrastructure and quietly resumed its financial and military activities. Over time, it would become a powerful force in Portuguese expansion, and through Prince Henry, the Navigator, play a central role in funding early exploration. In this way, the Templar system wasn't destroyed. It was transplanted. There's even evidence to suggest that parts of the church itself quietly absorbed Templar methods. A papal account book from 1321 shows structured entries for remote donations, coded disbursements, and scheduled repayments terminology that hadn't appeared in earlier ecclesiastical records. It's subtle, but telling. The same church that had condemned the Templars seemed happy to inherit their accounting style. What remains most fascinating is how little of this absorption was acknowledged. The Templar brand was too stained, too politically toxic, but their practices, their efficiencies, their ideas, those were valuable. So they lived on unattributed, like a melody heard in a new song, familiar but unclaimed. It's a quiet callback to the disappearance of the ledgers. Perhaps they weren't burned in full. Perhaps some were copied, salvaged, passed down like family heirlooms. Not all knowledge is written. Much is taught informally, silently. The assistant who watched the preceptor balance accounts. The courier who memorized the cipher for sealed letters. The steward who knew which fields funded which garrison. These fragments of understanding, scattered after the fall, found fertile soil elsewhere. So while the order died, its shadow stretched on. Across hospitaller storehouses, into noble treasuries, along Italian counting tables, and through Portuguese ships setting out into a wider world. The treasure was never a hoard of gold. It was a system. And systems once released do not vanish. They adapt. They flow. They find new hands. And if you look closely, you can still see the shape of the temple. Not in stone, but in numbers. When the Order of the Temple collapsed in the early 14th century, it left behind no central vault, no grand library of ledgers, no fixed point from which to trace the veins of its financial system. And yet, not long after, in the merchant cities of Italy, something stirred. In Florence, in Siena, in Genoa, and Venice, bankers emerged speaking a new financial language. They dealt not just in coin, but in credit abstraction and mobility. It was to the trained eye hauntingly familiar. At first glance, there's no direct line from the Templars to the early Italian banking houses. The Medici were merchants, not monks. The Bardi and Peruzzi answered to profit, not the Pope. But beneath the banners and family crests, the practices tell a subtler story, one of techniques carried forward, repurposed, and perfected in a new world. The clearest echo lies in the structure of long-distance financial transfers. By the 1320s, Italian bankers were regularly issuing bills of exchange contracts that allowed money to move without physically transporting coin. A Florentine could deposit funds at a bank, receive a letter, and his associate in Bruges or London could redeem it for local currency. The resemblance to Templar letters of credit is striking. Different context, different terminology, but the mechanics are eerily aligned. Historians debate whether this resemblance is the result of direct transmission or convergent evolution. But there are fragments that suggest contact. In Genoa, a record from 1315 details a request to verify the seal formerly used by the Brothers of the Temple submitted by a merchant guild seeking to authenticate an old document. This implies that not only were Templar instruments still in circulation, but that merchant bankers were studying them. Another telling detail comes from the training manuals used by early Italian banks. Several include instructions for reconciling accounts between distant branches using techniques that resemble the temple's decentralized yet interconnected system. Balances held in one city were offset by credits in another. This required trust, internal communication, and careful accounting, all features the Templars had pioneered. We also see hints of shared personnel. As noted previously, many of the lay brothers and clerks who once managed Templar records disappeared into the wider world after the order's suppression. Italy, with its booming trade networks and growing need for administrative talent, would have been a natural destination. A scribe fluent in Templar cipher might now be maintaining ledgers for the Bardi. A former preceptor's steward might now be managing cross-border payments for the Medici. These transitions left no clear paper trail, but the sudden sophistication of certain banking practices suggests a silent inheritance. It's not just the techniques, it's the mindset. The Templars had treated wealth as a fluid, mobile concept. Their vaults were storage, but their power lay in movement. They had learned to detach value from location to promise gold in acre based on silver deposited in London. That logic, abstract, systemic, trust-based, is the very core of banking. What's fascinating is how quickly the Italian banks adopted not only these ideas, but improved upon them. They developed double-entry bookkeeping, formalized interest through contractual loopholes, and created robust legal frameworks for credit. But beneath the innovation was a familiar foundation. The bridge between sacred order and secular finance may have passed silently through the hands of Templar survivors. One Genoese banker, writing in 1347, described his firm's network as a body with many hands, each knowing where the others move. The phrasing is poetic, but it also recalls the decentralized intelligence of the temple, a system where no single node held the full picture, but all worked in harmony. It's worth recalling the earlier chapters, the standardized accounting methods, the hidden infrastructure, the coded communication. All of these would have found ready use in the rising world of merchant finance, and the void left by the temple's collapse created a hunger for systems that worked for methods already tested. There's an important clarification to make here. The Templars were not the inventors of banking. Commercial finance had existed in the Roman world, and medieval Jewish and Muslim bankers had preserved and developed essential tools. But what the Templars contributed was something unique, a religiously protected transnational model of trust-based finance built within and ultimately beyond the framework of ecclesiastical law. And that model, once stripped of its sacred trappings, proved perfectly suited for secular refinement. So as the 14th century rolled on, and the Medici rose and Florence minted gold florins that would dominate trade for a century, the echoes of the temple rang quietly beneath the counting tables. Not as superstition, not as conspiracy, but as structure, logic, pattern. The Red Cross had vanished, but the method remained. And as gold flowed through the hands of Florentine merchants and into the treasuries of kings, it did so along channels first carved by monks in mail channels the world had tried to bury, but which refused to be forgotten. The world the Templars knew was one of parchment and plows of handwritten charters and flickering candlelight. And yet, within that medieval framework, they implemented techniques that wouldn't be widely recognized for centuries. Long before the invention of modern banking, central banks, or fiduciary law, The order quietly pioneered financial mechanisms that now underpin global economies. Their genius, if we can call it that, was not an invention, but an integration. They borrowed, adapted, and aligned disparate systems into a cohesive whole that served their mission to move money where armies could not, to build structures where monarchs hesitated, and to hold trust where kings failed. And they did all of this with tools most rulers didn't even know existed. Take, for example, their management of remote assets. The Templars developed a remarkably early form of asset pooling, consolidating income from farms' rents and tithes across vast regions, then reallocating those resources based on strategic need. It wasn't just about revenue collection. It was dynamic redistribution. A struggling commandery in the Levant might be supplied by surplus from estates in Burgundy. That meant someone somewhere had to know what was available, what was needed, and how to prioritize disbursement. This implied forecasting planning, even rudimentary budgeting. One fragment from a 13th century commandery in Champagne outlines seasonal projections, expected yields, likely expenses, estimated tithe contributions. It reads like a primitive financial report. More than a static list, it reflects an evolving awareness that money, like grain, must be managed over time, not just space. And then there's the question of reserves. Some records hint that the Templars maintained liquidity buffers, holding back a percentage of revenues to address future uncertainty. In modern terms, that's risk management. No medieval kingdom had anything so structured. But the Templars, operating outside the normal boundaries of feudal finance, had the freedom and the necessity to develop such tools. Their system demanded resilience. Their internal accounting methods, touched on earlier, also reveal a sophisticated grasp of consistency and standardization. Multiple documents from disparate regions use the same formats, the same marginal notations, even the same calendar structures. This suggests shared training, perhaps even centralized directives. In an age without printing presses, that kind of uniformity was rare and powerful. It allowed information to be portable, understandable across borders. In effect, they created a standardized financial language long before governments did the same. One especially revealing glimpse comes from a parchment discovered in Avignon, a record of obligations from 3 separate commanderies written in a common cipher with entries reconciled through a central balancing formula. The technique matched credits and debits logged across regions, allowing for delayed transfers. It's not just record-keeping, it's settlement. The order also appears to have understood the importance of reputational credit. We saw earlier how their sealed letters, promises of future payment, were accepted as good as gold across regions. But what's notable is how rarely these letters were defaulted upon. The trust placed in the temple wasn't just spiritual, it was procedural. Their systems worked. Their documents meant something. This kind of institutional credibility is the very basis of modern finance. Perhaps most surprising is how the Templars handled internal accountability. While direct records are scarce, the scattered complaints and correspondence that survive suggest that the order conducted internal audits. There are references to traveling officers, visitors who reviewed local finances, inspected records, and issued reports to higher command. One letter from a Sardinian preceptory complains of corrections imposed by the visitor and refers to improper entries being voided. Auditing in the 1200s. These innovations didn't emerge from theory. They came from necessity. The order was at its heart a logistical engine. It needed to feed troops, pay workers, fund construction, settle debts, and do it all across a decentralized, yet tightly connected network. So it developed tools that allowed it to function under pressure. Tools that modern bankers and economists would recognize. What makes this all the more remarkable is the context. The Templars were not secular merchants chasing profit. They were monks. Their outward identity was spiritual, their rule rooted in piety. And yet they functioned with a discipline and precision that rivaled any royal treasury or merchant guild. And this paradox, humble warriors managing a sprawling, sophisticated financial network, only deepens the mystery of their downfall. Because when Philip IV dismantled the order, he didn't just destroy a military brotherhood, he disrupted a financial technology. We often look for history's breakthroughs in the obvious places: inventions, declarations, revolutions. But sometimes the real advances are buried in ledgers, in marginalia, in the quiet techniques of men who never called themselves economists, but who behaved like ones. The Templars didn't predict modern banking, but they rehearsed it. And in doing so, they left behind not just buildings, not just myths, but a blueprint. For all their brilliance, for all the subtlety and structure of their financial methods, the Templars' system was never built to survive scrutiny, not the kind that came with fire and crown, not the kind that turned reputation into suspicion. Their network was powerful, but it was also delicate, unwritten in places, protected by secrecy, dependent on trust, and trust once broken is hard to recover. The most obvious pressure came from politics. As we've seen, Philip IV of France viewed the Templars as a threat, not because of what they had done, but because of what they were: a parallel financial authority, a shadow system immune to taxation, aloof from royal commands. It didn't matter that the Templars weren't plotting rebellion. Their very existence posed a challenge to the emerging logic of centralized monarchy. Kings by the early 1300s were changing. They were no longer just military leaders or spiritual figures. They were becoming bureaucrats, tax collectors, administrators. And the Templars, with their own network, their own rules, their own capacity to store and move wealth, looked increasingly like competitors. Then came the legal pressure. The Church, too, was shifting. No longer content to operate as a decentralized web of influence, the papacy sought tighter control over religious orders, over doctrine, and crucially, over money. The Templars had grown up in a more fluid ecclesiastical world. But by the 14th century, the tide had turned. Their exemptions, once granted as divine favor, were now seen as dangerous loopholes, too powerful to be ignored, too autonomous to be tolerated. The Templars also failed to adapt. Their system worked, yes, but it worked quietly, in the shadows, with closed books, closed lips, and careful silences. They had no real mechanism for transparency, no public explanation of how their finances operated. That opacity had once been an asset, a way to shield donors, to protect operations. But in the new climate of suspicion, it became a liability. Imagine for a moment if the Templars had published their ledgers, if they had opened their vaults, shown the kings, the bishops, even the common people, exactly what they did and how. It might not have saved them, but it would have changed the narrative. Instead, their silence fed the fire, and in that silence others wrote stories of hidden idols, of black masses of gold that whispered blasphemies. There's also the question of fragility. The temple's financial system was vast, but it wasn't decentralized in the way we imagine today. It depended heavily on key nodes: the Paris Temple, the administrative cores in Aragon, Cyprus, London. When those centers fell, the network unraveled quickly. The documents vanished. The riders stopped. The notes of credit lost their anchors. It was like cutting a harp string, not loud, but immediate. And we can't ignore the emotional pressure. The Templars were at their core human. Many were warriors first, not accountants. When the arrests came, some burned records out of fear. Others fled. Some simply froze. The system required discipline, but discipline fails under torture, under betrayal, under the slow realization that the world has turned against you. Even their own identity worked against them. The combination of monk and knight, once their greatest brand, had become a contradiction. How could men sworn to poverty manage royal treasuries? How could holy warriors claim neutrality in wars they profited from? Their image no longer matched the world's expectations. And when that happens, perception becomes poison. There's one final quiet factor: obsolescence. The Templars had built a system for a specific era, one defined by the Crusades, by papal authority, by networks of trust across a fractured Christendom. But by the early 1300s, that world was fading. The Crusader states were lost. The papacy was under siege. Secular states were rising. New forms of finance, secular, profit-driven, legally codified, were emerging in Italy and beyond. In a way, the Templar system had done its job too well. It had shown what was possible: long-distance credit, internal audit, reserve systems, reputation-backed instruments. And once those ideas were out, others could adopt them, refine them, strip them of religious trappings, and use them in ways the Templars never could. So the system did not collapse because it failed. It collapsed because it succeeded too quietly, too opaquely, too soon. Because it refused to evolve when the world shifted. Because it trusted that what had always worked would keep working even in a different climate. And because in the end, it had no defense against a simple, brutal truth that power without transparency becomes threat. By the time the last embers cooled in the fires that consumed Jacques de Molay, the formal face of the Knights Templar had vanished. Their properties were seized, their leaders dead or imprisoned, and their once feared name scrubbed from ledgers and lips alike. And yet their financial methods didn't vanish. They just changed hands and changed shape. What we're left with isn't a treasure map. It's not a ledger full of secrets. It's a ghost network. A system that once moved vast sums across continents, now dissolved but not entirely erased. The faint traces remain not in vaults or ruins, but in the habits of institutions that came after. Practices passed on through osmosis, not inheritance. Techniques absorbed by necessity, not conquest. There's something almost spectral about the way it unfolds. One moment, a Templar knight in Acre is reconciling accounts with a commandery in Toulouse. A generation later, a Florentine banker is offering a bill of exchange with nearly identical logic, but with no mention of the order, no citation, just method. This is the essence of a ghost network, not a conspiracy, not a secret cabal, but a functional legacy drained of its branding, its mythology, its banners, and repurposed to fit the needs of a changing world. Consider how many Templar assets simply passed into other hands. The Hospitallers, the church regional lords, even rival merchant institutions. Some properties were repurposed overnight. Others remained dormant only to be reopened decades later under different names. But the documents, the vaults, the networks, those didn't always vanish. Some were buried, some were copied, some were quietly studied. In Spain, there are whispers of former Templar clerks working for noble houses into the late 14th century. Their role: managing estates, handling rents, negotiating long-distance financial arrangements. The names changed, but the skills remained. If a former Templar scribe began working for the Crown of Aragon, did he stop using the ciphers he knew, the bookkeeping formats he mastered? Probably not. Then there's the intriguing case of the German Hanseatic League. Independent, fiercely commercial, and known for creating a merchant-run trade empire. Their accounting systems bore a strange resemblance to the types of summaries found in surviving Templar estate reports. Again, not proof, but patterns. What makes the Ghost Network so elusive is that it wasn't hidden on purpose. It was dispersed. The suppression of the Templars was political and theatrical, a warning shot against autonomous power. But the tools they used weren't heretical. They were useful. And so, like any useful tool, they were picked up by others. One Roman Catholic chronicler in the 1380s lamented that the brothers of commerce now conduct their affairs as if they wore white mantles, a bitter echo of a time when monks could outfinance monarchs. He didn't mean it as praise, but he might have accidentally recorded one of the last living memories of the ghost system in motion. The greatest irony, the Templars never tried to preserve their financial system for posterity. It wasn't designed to be a model. It was a means to an end supporting the Order's mission. But its very design, modular, mobile, trust-based, made it easy to fragment and adapt. You didn't need to inherit the whole machine. A single cog, a single protocol could survive and thrive in new hands. There's even a strange poetry to it. A system built in secrecy, surviving only because it dissolved into anonymity. Like the Red Cross washed off stone, but the stone itself still bearing weight. So what remains? The Ghost Network isn't a single structure, a vault, or a document. It's the distributed memory of a method, a logic that shaped everything from bills of exchange to transnational accounting. Not because it was sacred, but because it worked. And perhaps that's the most Templar ending of all, a legacy not enshrined in gold or glory, but in quiet continuity. In the hands of clerks who never swore an oath, in the ledgers of men who never saw Jerusalem, in systems that endured precisely because their creators did not. The Templars vanished, but the way they moved money didn't. So what, after all, did the Templars really leave behind? No one found the treasure they were supposed to have hidden. No troves of gold beneath the Paris Temple. No mountains of coin in some forgotten fort. And certainly no master ledger chronicling the secrets of their financial empire. That part of the legend remains just that legend. But legends don't linger this long unless they're built on something solid. And what remains isn't treasure in the traditional sense. It's something quieter, more potent methodology. At the heart of the Templar system was an understanding centuries ahead of its time that wealth is not merely a physical thing. Gold can be melted, stolen, counted. But trust is transportable. Trust survives borders, outlives kings, seeps into the marrow of institutions. That's what they understood. That's what they mastered. They didn't invent banking. The ancient world had credit systems, contracts, money lending. But the Templars bound it all into something new, a traveling infrastructure of trust. Their system was rooted in reputation, maintained by consistency, and shielded by loyalty. They streamlined exchanges across oceans and deserts, organized ledgers across fractured kingdoms, and moved funds without ever moving metal. That's not just logistics. That's vision. And what they left behind, truly left behind, was a pattern, a way of thinking. In later centuries, when Italian merchant banks rose, when double-entry bookkeeping became the norm, when national treasuries began to formalize fiscal systems, it was easy to forget the Order of the Temple. Easy to let their methods dissolve into broader trends. But traces remained. In formats, in ciphers, in practices taught not in schools, but through service. One ledger handed to another, a technique whispered across generations. The Templars didn't leave monuments. They left fingerprints. Even modern systems echo with this logic. Today's international financial architecture, with its reliance on symbols of trust, transferable credit, and institutional memory, shares a lineage of thought, if not direct inheritance. You don't need a surviving manuscript to transmit that. Ideas move like seeds quietly, persistently on the wind. And perhaps the most telling evidence is how the world responded to their disappearance. Kings raced to replicate their functions. Churchmen scrambled to justify their seizure. Merchant families tried and sometimes failed to recreate their reach. If the system had been meaningless, it wouldn't have mattered. But its absence created a vacuum, one that others rushed to fill, rarely matching its subtle strength. Even now, scholars argue over how much influence the Templars truly had. Were they proto-bankers or just efficient stewards? Was their model revolutionary or simply well executed? The debates continue, but beneath them is an undeniable truth: the systems they built endured, even when the order itself did not. And maybe that's the quiet brilliance of their legacy. Not a shout, not a relic, not a buried vault, but a whisper that shaped the world. A silent shift in how we move value, how we record obligation, how we measure trust. That's what they left behind. The story of the Templars' financial system doesn't end with smoke or swords. It ends in silence, a silence that echoes in every transaction, every ledger, every line of code that now moves numbers across the globe. We tend to think of influence as something loud, obvious, declared in monuments or manifestos. But the most enduring influence often moves without a name. Today, when a person swipes a card in Paris and their account updates in Tokyo, they're relying on an invisible structure of trust and transmission, a network that carries money the way breath carries speech. The names have changed. The symbols are different. But the blueprint, the logic of credit, reputation, and correspondence remains familiar. It's the logic the Templars practiced. Not all of it survived, of course. The secrecy, the rituals, the sacred underpinnings, those withered with time. But the system's architecture, resilient, responsive, cross-border, is still very much alive. Modern banks speak of liquidity settlement clearinghouses. The language is new, but the goal is old: to turn trust into motion, to move value without moving risk, to store power invisibly. And in that sense, the Templars were not just early adopters. They were architects of the possible. Their blueprint didn't survive in archives. It survived in patterns repeated, refined, and rebranded across centuries. Not because anyone preserved it consciously, but because it worked. Efficient systems find a way to replicate even without stewards. It's a ghost story of sorts. A tale of a vanished order whose principles live on in silence, not haunting us with fear, but quietly shaping the world we built on top of theirs. So the next time you see a digital transfer, or hear of banks too big to fail, remember that centuries ago, in a candlelit commandery, monks in armor were solving the same problems with parchment and memory, secrecy and skill. They didn't set out to change the world. They just needed to move money. And in doing so, they taught the rest of us how. Now, take a breath. Let it settle in your chest. Feel the stillness behind the numbers, the hush behind the gold. Close your eyes and imagine a candle flickering in a stone chamber, a seal pressed into wax, a rider disappearing into the night with a message that no one else would ever read. That's where it started. And somehow, we're still following the trail, quietly, unknowingly, faithfully. Sleep well, traveler. The ledgers are closed. The secrets are safe.